And in fact, what Armen has written about is about preventative action. So I'm not going to stay here much longer because we've got some fantastic people here this evening. I'm going to start, of course, with the Lord Mayor of the City of London. Very honoured to have him here, Alderman Professor Michael Mainelli. Thank you.
Well, wow, what a great way to start today. We are here to celebrate Armen's book, and that's what we're here to do. And I'd like to start really first with a thanks to the Chartered Accountants for the whole and for all the various people who've organized this and been behind it. And in fact, it was George Littlejohn who said, I don't care how busy you are, you better come down here and help Armen launch his book. For those who don't know me, yes, I am Alderman Professor Michael Mainelli, and I am the 695th Lord Mayor of the City of London, the world's oldest democratic workers and residents cooperative, and that's what we are. And I'm thrilled to join you for the launch of this book, Hardwiring Sustainability into Financial Mathematics. I'm also thrilled because I've just returned from COP28 in Dubai late last night, and I was there highlighting, obviously, the critical role the city must play in meeting our climate goals. Now, as a scientist by trade, my mantra is very much trust the science. And when it comes to climate change, the science is all too clear. We've got 1.1 degree of warming already, and it's resulting in devastating impacts for people in the planet. And we know that if we fail to make changes by approximately 2100, 75% of the world's population is not looking in very good shape. So, stuff needs to get done. Now, Armen's book, though, is an interesting exploration of the case for hardwiring the sustainability into the mass. And I would certainly agree that space and responsibility for impact should be integrated into our equations of value and return, which is what the theme of the book's about. And I myself have had similar explorations with CISI and George into confidence accounting, which is looking at ways of reflecting the uncertainty inherent in sustainability itself and how we go about valuing our balance sheets. Now, Armen, as you say, if we're serious about reaching net zero, sustainability must be achieved at the level of our monetary architecture, as well as products, businesses, and investments, public and private. And if investors must make responsible and sustainable choices, we, the monetary system, must provide them with clear information about how to make those decisions. I've always looked at the global monetary system as the world's great decision-making engine. And if we're putting garbage in, we'll get garbage out. So we need to be much clearer about what we specify. Now, my theme as Lord Mayor this year is Connect to Prosper, and I'm trying to celebrate the many knowledge miles that we have running through the square mile of the City of London. And these miles run out into the world. And I term us, very much the world's coffee house. That's what I see us as, in the tradition of the old penny universities that thrived in the 17th and 18th century. People used to go into these coffee shops more for the intellectual stimulation than for the coffee. Once you paid a penny, you could have as much coffee as you wanted, but you got to sit there and listen and learn from the great minds of the day. It was, of course, from those coffee shops that sprang the Baltic Exchange, the London Stock Exchange, and Lloyd's. So I believe that collaboration is really crucial. Now, although you might say the City of London is the world's oldest democratic workers and residents cooperative, we couldn't be more modern in our commitment to protecting the planet's future. We were the first local government body to pass a Clean Air Act in 1953. We were at Rio. We were at every single COP. We wrote the papers that helped to create the acid rain markets, the SOx and NOx markets in the early 90s, that led to the commitment to COP3 in Kyoto that we would in fact be using emissions trading for carbon as well. And we created the carbon markets here in London for the EU, which launched them in April 2005. So we've been very, very much behind it and feel quite avuncular, frankly, towards those carbon markets. At a personal level, we decided in 2018 to set a goal of net zero by 2027. We have slashed our carbon emissions by 66% across our estate in the last 5 years. So we're well on track for 2027. But I won't claim it's easy. It's turned out to be a little bit more expensive than we'd anticipated. We've also set a goal of net zero 2040 for the entirety of the square mile. So that's not just us, that's the entire community of 615,000 people who work here. And of those 615,000 people who work here, One of the things I'm emphasizing is the point that London is a problem-solving center. We have 45,000 insurers, 55,000 bankers. That's 100,000 out of 615,000. What do the other 500,000 do all day? Well, they do things like law and accountancy and actuarial sciences, but actually over 200,000 are scientists, engineers, and technicians, and always have been. London is the home to Gresham College, 1579. The Royal Society springs out of it in 1660. We have 40 research institutes, 40 learned societies, 70 institutes of higher education, and 130 research institutes within 2 miles of here. I don't need to go out to Oxford or Cambridge. I don't even need to go to the Royal Holloway and Egham. It's an intense concentration of knowledge workers. And as the world is becoming more multidisciplinary, and Armen's book, I think, emphasizes that, is the attempt to integrate many disciplines. You can't do this type of financial mathematics without science as well. You can't do the maths without the maths. And it's not just about commerce and money. So we do want to establish ourselves as a one-stop shop, and we want to advocate innovative areas of finance and innovative areas of technology and innovative areas of management and governance. So the idea here is that if we're going to be the preeminent international global financial center that we claim to be and are, well, we have to stay in front of the game. And if this is where it's headed, we want to support it. I was delighted at COP to announce that we will be hosting the Net Zero Delivery Summit for the 3rd time here next June in London. This is a private forum which checkpoints the government forums at COP. And we're going to be focusing this time on what innovation the private sector can provide across science and technology, and I would actually argue financial mathematics as well. And my objective really is to focus very much on the carbon. For those who aren't aware, 23% of global emissions are covered by a credible ETS. That's in 25 years. That's not bad, actually. It's not good enough, but it's not bad, and we should be aiming to increase that as much as possible. So, Armen, congratulations once more on the publication of this additional book. You do set out a compelling argument as to why we should integrate responsibility and sustainability into our core finance models. And so in closing, friends, I just remind you that in 1997, the United Nations Brundtland Commission defined sustainability as meeting the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. And though our views on the best pathways to net zero may differ in some areas and converge in others, I think we can all agree with this sentiment. And so I'd close on a quote from a gentleman, Armen somebody or other. As disappointed as one may be by humanity's current failings, we must steer clear of a deeper hopelessness. And I'm personally hopeful that if we come together and connect, we will prosper and preserve our precious planet for future generations. Thank you all for your time, and I look forward to the other presentations and a successful book launch. Thank you.
Thank you, Lord Mayor, for that. Our next presenter was hoping to be here tonight, but I'm afraid train strikes and other matters conspired, so we can now beam him in a la, there we are. Not live, I have to say, this is recorded, but Eoin Murray, who is the head of investment for Federated Hermes, who provided their generous support in helping us to put on this evening and the catering. So Eoin sent us this message. Are you able to play that for us?
Thank you, Armen, for asking me to speak at your book launch this evening. It's my absolute honour to do so, and I'm extremely sad that I could not be there in person for this wonderful event. It's entirely justified that your book is gaining such attention. I think that it is fair to say that updates to our thinking about finance and investment are rarer than hen's teeth. For asset pricing and portfolio theory, we find the foundational elements in the efficient market hypothesis and the capital asset pricing model, based on work by such luminaries as Markowitz, Sharpe, Lintner, Traynor, and Miller back in the 1960s. Building on that, work in the 70s and 80s gave us a better understanding of factor modelling down to academics such as Farmer, French, Carhart and others, and derivatives pricing led principally by Black and Scholes. By the time we get to the 1990s, psychologists and behavioural scientists had become involved. Individuals like Thaler, Kahneman and Barbaras, keen to explain pricing anomalies that did not fit the prevalent understanding of patterns through reference to behavioural finance. All in all, I think you will agree, very few seminal pieces of work over the last 6 decades have caused us to truly rethink our approach. So it is entirely appropriate that we shine a bright light on hardwiring sustainability into financial mathematics by Dr. Papazian, as representing the first serious attempt, along with his earlier work, The Space Value of Money, published last year, to bring financial and investment theory into the modern world. Finance and investing cannot exist in isolation, and it is imperative that we try to improve our knowledge of assets, portfolios, and of markets by incorporating an understanding of how they interact with some of the greatest challenges that our society faces today, namely climate change and biodiversity and ecosystem loss. This work is not just a simple update to our existing thinking, but a different approach altogether, one that leaves us far better equipped to overcome the hurdles that confront us. Regulators, corporates and governments are in full flight as we witness events unfold this week and last in Dubai at COP28, and it is incumbent on the investment industry to do its bit, to play its part. To do so, we need a new framework, and that is what Armen has provided us with. A theoretical treatise and a set of new models that incorporate the broad concept of sustainability with that of markets. To get our heads around the alphabet soup that we face, whether it's accounting standards like ISSB, SASB or VRF, or disclosure regimes like TCFD, TNFD or CSRD, or just plain reporting requirements like IFRS and ESRS, we need to think harder about how we practically integrate the implications of emissions trends, of pollution, of nature loss into our decisions about capital deployment, asset allocation, and risk management. From there, too, we can properly begin to reflect on the broader implications for macroeconomic policy and implementation. This is what the book brings. Armen, I have 2 specific hopes for this excellent work. Firstly, that it becomes a standard textbook in every college and university for any student of finance. And secondly, that we remember that we have a responsibility to our clients, the pensioners, insurers, and savers, to incorporate your learnings in order to do the best job that we can for them. It is our modern fiduciary duty. Thank you, and I wish you every success with the launch of this wonderful book.
That was worth having been in, I think you'll all agree. Next up, we have the Cambridge Judge Business School, Head of Alumni and External Engagement, Mary Priddey.
Good evening, everybody. Delighted to be here this evening, and thank you very much, Armen, for extending the invitation. It's wonderful to be representing Cambridge Judge Business School, and it's clear from the book and from knowing your story, Armen, that the interactions, relationships and discussions that came from your time and continued engagement with the university have played a role in the process of bringing this book into being. Cambridge Judge Business School prides itself in being in the business of transformation on real-world impact. And tonight we will hear from an author which shows how the world could change. As an alumnus, Armen truly embodies this ethos, with sustainability no longer just being a buzzword, but becoming a key point of the business landscape is the perfect time for education to follow suit. In September 2024, Cambridge Judge Business School will be welcoming onto campus, onto the Cambridge MBA, the first of our students to follow the MBA in Sustainability pathway. With Armen's Cambridge connections, no doubt his book will be amongst the classroom discussions, if not even the teaching. Armen, you do truly embody the ethos of the school, and I look forward to learning more about your journey tonight. Thank you.
Now, I know a few people have to leave us early tonight, not just for train strikes, but for other commitments. So I will invite up George Littlejohn, who's the Senior Advisor for the Chartered Institute of Securities and Investment, who's then going to introduce Armen after that. But if anybody has to leave, please don't think any ill of it, including the Lord Mayor, I know has pressing commitments to move on to. So George, can I just invite you up?
Thank you, Adrian. And these are three difficult speakers to follow. I should warn you that, like the Lord Mayor, I'm an accountant, and while it's possible to take the accountant out of accountancy, taking the accountancy out of the accountant is tricky. So I may be boring here, in which case I apologise. But the Lord Mayor has shown that accountants do not have to be boring. Now, I think, and the Lord Mayor mentioned something very interesting earlier, which we might come back to later, which is confidence accounting, a project which he conducted with us and another accountancy body, which will be nameless, 11 years ago, and which is about to come back to life. And essentially, it's about the matter of economia here, the goddess of accounting, whom we all worship every morning, who has got in this description on the front of the lectern some rather crude measuring tools, which might actually be rather more effective than some of the measuring tools that we actually use today. We've learned from this past year that the one thing about climate change is that time is not our friend. Here in the Northern Hemisphere, we've had the hottest summer ever, and we've had extreme weather events around the world. And it's certainly shown us the importance of COP28 and the financial sector in producing pragmatic solutions that will fast-track the net zero transition. Now, the financial sector at large has a critical role to play in this endeavour. We all know that Mark Carney gave us an injunction 3 years ago in his speech at Guildhall 1 February on the path to COP26 in the beautiful town of Glasgow, or city of Glasgow, that in future every financial decision must take climate into account. And that is something that we and all the other major professional bodies have been working on. And we've got some brilliant young experts in the field sitting in the room here today. Dr. Papazian's book, Armen, I will call him because he's a great friend, is a wonderful highlight of the many ways in which we can develop our understanding and our measurement and use of data in this field. Now, one thing which has occupied our attention, certainly my attention for the past months at CISI, has been the 695th Lord Mayor's Ethical AI Initiative. We launched at the Mansion House a couple of weeks ago a new certificate in the ethical deployment of AI. And that's brought to our minds, to the forefront of our minds, the great importance of data, that unless we have proper, accurate data to use, artificial intelligence becomes pretty useless. Many projects we're engaged in become unmeasurable and impossible to control. So data, absolutely vital, and the sort of data which is woven through much of Armen's work, both in this book and in the previous one, which I would highly commend as well. That's not available for you, you've got to buy that, but I would recommend it. So very effective. So essentially, to do this effectively, the financial ecosystem does need consistent, reliable decision-making, decision-useful climate data, critical information that's historically been very challenging to put together for investors and very hard for investors, as Eoin well knows, to find. London Stock Exchange Group recently did an analysis of the around 4,000 large listed companies that make up the FTSE All-World Index, and 40% of those don't disclose their operational carbon emissions. Now, that is a serious emission for much of the world's corporate sector. And a gap of this size makes it difficult for investors to monitor and reduce the emissions that are aligned to their investment objectives. Now, on last Saturday, there was a very important announcement at COP28 by the French President, Emmanuel Macron, and Michael Bloomberg, with apologies to Eoin. He's already apologized for the number of acronyms in this field. Another acronym which we must all learn to use, which I've got to read out because I can't remember it, the NZDPU. Would anyone care to tell me what the NZDPU stands for? Unfair question to those who were in COP28, but it's the Net Zero Data Public Utility. Now, this has been was a development by the UN Secretary General in particular, or more precisely, Emmanuel Macron in his role as the UN Secretary General's envoy on climate ambition and solutions. Michael Bloomberg, who said on Saturday, now you might say Michael Bloomberg would say this, but he said the most valuable currency in financial markets is reliable data. If you own one of the world's biggest data companies, you would say that. But he went on to say that this new data portal, which is the NZDPU, which stands for, as you will recall, the Net Zero Data Public Utility. There'll be a test on this later. This new data portal will allow investors and regulators to see which companies are making progress on their commitments, while also empowering the public to hold companies accountable for backing up words with actions. And he was clear in thanking Macron in helping with this project. Now, recently, 3 weeks ago, London Stock Exchange held a fascinating series of events looking at how some companies are leaders in the transition to net zero and some are laggards, and how the laggards are likely to be the companies that, with Armen's financial models, are likely to prove non-existent in a few years' time. A couple of days later, we had a wonderful, fascinating event at BlackRock, major asset managers, which looked at duration in investment management. What they were analysing were the companies in their database, which happens to be about 4,000 companies, a different set from the FTSE index, but 4,000 biggest companies in the world. The companies there, which they regarded as having the ability to be held for 10 years without selling them. And the number of that companies was just 50. So they only believed that 50 companies would be worth holding for 50 years, whatever the cycle said, and would continue to be valuable businesses throughout the period. That was quite eye-opening. The companies included people like, for instance, LVMH, which is probably BlackRock's favorite company, which fits in neatly with Armen's sustainability models. And basically, Bernard Arnault never ever sells shares, never has done. He's very, very kind to people who want to sell his shares in difficult times by buying them up. So he just simply buys all the shares. He's now worth $200 billion, having been given $15 million not many decades ago to set up the business by his father. This door sometimes doesn't open from the outside. Incidentally, if I start talking about accountancy, these doors lock automatically and you can't leave. We've all seen the great work that's been done over recent years by the acronyms that Eoin spoke about, led by many people in this very chamber. There's a woman, for instance, called Veronica Poole, who's global leader of IFRS at Deloitte, who is one of the great instigators of the International Sustainability Standards Board. And there's much else to be said about accountancy, but I'm conscious that the Lord Mayor has to leave in 2 minutes and that Dr. Papazian would like to thank him. So I'm going to shut up there. We might carry on the discussion about accountancy later on, about Armen's wonderful books, not just book, and about his great work otherwise. But Armen, thank you for inviting all of us today. It's much appreciated, and to the publishers and to Federated Hermes for sponsoring the event and so on. But I know you would like to say a few words to the Lord Mayor. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to start by thanking the Lord Mayor for his presence, his generosity, and his work in advancing, in promoting and encouraging societal advance through finance and technology. I find it inspiring, and I look forward to have any contribution that I can make to whatever plans he may have. But as mentioned already, the Lord Mayor will be leaving us now. So thank you. This is a small token of my appreciation and a partner's appreciation. Thank you.
2 copies to go.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Yes. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Before I start, and before our MC starts the clock, I also have a few thank yous to say. So I would like to, well, first of all, express my gratitude to all the partner institutions, the City of London, Federated Hermes Limited, Cambridge Judge Business School, King's College, Cambridge, the Chartered Institute for Securities and Investment, Papazian Macmillan, and to the Space Value Foundation, as well as ICAEW for this venue and for our online webinar. I also would like to express my gratitude to Dr. Gillian Ted and Dr. Ivan Collister, Provost and First Bursar of King's College, Cambridge, to Professor Gishan Dissanayake, Dean of the Cambridge Judge Business School, to Tracy Vegro, CEO of the CISI, to Tula Weiss, the Executive Editor of Finance Economics at Palgrave Macmillan. Thank you for your support. I also owe special thanks to Dr. Sakar Nusevic, Chief Executive Officer of Federated Hermes, for writing the foreword for the book and his support. And of course, Eoin, Mary, George, Adrian, you've made it real. So thank you very much for being here and for all your kind words. Last but not least, I want to thank all of you for being here and for everyone watching online. So thank you. So let me start with some facts. The Paris Agreement entered into force in November 2016. And as of today, CO2 levels keep rising. Fossil fuel subsidies are at a record level of $7 trillion in 2022. And recently in the UK, we've just given away a few hundred licenses for new explorations. This is a fact. Similarly, and in parallel, as of right now, it is estimated that there are 50 to 75 trillion pieces of plastics and microplastics in our oceans. We are leaking around 11 million metric tons of plastic per year into the oceans. If the trends continue and stay as they are, we're going to end up with 29 million metric tons leaking into the oceans by 2040. Similarly, and in parallel, we have, as of now, 36,500 debris greater than 1 centimeter orbiting the planet. There are 130 million debris between 1 millimeter and 1 centimeter also orbiting our planet. Estimated that the total is greater than 9,000 metric tons. In fact, if you were to look at the visually from 1960 to 2019, this is what we've done. Now, if you can notice, the trend and the evidence is clear. And I can give examples on municipal solid waste. I can give you examples and trends on chemical waste, on a host of other sewage in our rivers and beaches, etc., etc. And you will notice that the human productivity is evidently oblivious to what it leaves behind. And it is unconcerned with how it endangers its very own continuity based on the facts. Now, we have littered every environment we've come to touch, basically. Now, that implies that, first of all, our challenge goes far beyond the carbon emissions and the climate. And second, that we need to reinvent human productivity. Now, my argument, the argument that I make in both books, is that the root cause, and therefore the solution to the challenges we face, is in our financial value framework and in our financial mathematics. Why? Well, first of all, let me give you a few examples. These are bond valuation equations, which many of you are familiar with, I'm sure. This is option pricing model, stock valuation models, asset pricing models. This is not a comprehensive list of financial models, but it's a representative one. If you were to actually observe these equations closely, you notice that the parameters used within them are either time and or risk proxies. Both are being used. Time and risk proxies are used to measure the value of cash flows and returns. There are no context parameters in any of them. Not one, not two, not some of them. None of them have any context parameters. Now, I argue that this, in fact, this time and risk focus in our mathematics reflects the value framework upon which they are built. That framework is built on two principles of value. One of them is time value of money, and the other one is risk and return. Time value of money states that $1 today is worth more than $1 tomorrow, because $1 today can be invested and therefore it can earn and therefore become more than $1 by tomorrow. Risk and return states that the higher the risk, the higher the expected return. And the logic behind is that given the risk-averse nature of investors, higher risks imply higher expectations of reward. Now, I argue that if you were to think about these principles, you're going to notice that these two principles leave our evolutionary investments in a blind spot. Why? Because all our evolutionary investments require massive investments in the present, and they imply distant cash flows, distant returns, and very high risks. Both features are negatively priced with these principles. Now, let me give you a closer example. This is one equation, which is the net present value equation, which is at the core of all the discounting models, cash flow valuation models, bond valuation models, and others, and show you the mathematical as well as theoretical junction where we omit context. Now, the net present value equation has two parts. It has one is the actual part, the first part, which is the investment, the actual investment. And then the second part is the non-actual element, which are the future expected cash flows. Now notice, the mathematical sophistication, the relative mathematical sophistication is applied to the non-actual future, while that which is actual and the only actual element of the equation is simply treated with a negative sign. There's no more treatment to the initial investment, which is the only certain element in the equation. Why is it so? Because, well, it is an outflow for the mortal, risk-averse, return-maximizing investor, which is the only stakeholders of our financial mathematics. Now, there is no context because we are limiting the treatment of the initial investment to a negative sign. And that's where space and context is abstracted. Now, I actually argue that there is an entire analytical dimension missing in our framework, and that's of space. Now, space I define as the physical context of matter that stretches from subatomic space to interstellar space and every layer in between and beyond. I offer this conceptualization as an example. Each layer can be broken down into further layers. Every sub-layer could be further broken down into many more layers depending on the cash flows that we are actually looking at. Now, if we're missing a dimension of analysis, if the analytical dimension of space is missing in our framework and in our equations, can we be surprised with the state of the world? Why? Well, because when we abstract the dimension of space, we're also abstracting our responsibility for space impact in and on space. And that's the junction where, well, the current state of the world, our current predicament is in a way, by default, the result of our current framework of value in finance. Now, does sustainable finance actually address this issue with all the acronyms that were mentioned earlier on? Well, first of all, we haven't managed to change trajectory yet. Let's be clear about that. And then most of the frameworks and standards of sustainable finance today are actually voluntary, except the ESRS, which will become mandatory. Another important point that they're all focused on the reporting of information, not their interpretation. In other words, what investors do with that information is yet to be discussed. And then third, if you were to look at ESG ratings specifically, ESG ratings do not measure impact, and they are more like opinion points rather than data points. They don't come with a framework of analysis with which investors can interpret additional marginal information that arrives to them, that is released in between rating updates. And in reality, if you were to explore ESG integration in practice, you will find out that in the end result is to basically adjust our variables in our existing models. So in other words, the entire sustainable finance field as of today does not penetrate nor transform our current financial value framework. So in other words, our spaceless equations remain intact. And if you were to look for the words, just anecdotally, for the three words, risk, time, and space, in the document that established the TCFD framework and the latest two IFRS standards, you're going to find that risk and time are all over the place. Can you guess how many times space is mentioned? 0. Now, okay, we have a missing dimension. This issue hasn't been addressed yet. So if we were to introduce the dimension of space, our physical context of matter, into our financial models, then what's the next step is that, well, first of all, why are we going to treat it as layers? What's the point about having layers of space? Well, very important. First, because our cash flows and investments affect different layers of space. A genetic, a nanotechnology firm may have 0 emissions, but may be creating nanotoxins. A cargo company shipping its products or its cargo with ships will affect the hydrosphere. Those who affect or send their cargo with airplanes will be affecting the stratosphere, etc., etc. So first, the value chains of our investments differ, and therefore the space layers helps that analysis. Second, because impact intensity differs. GHG emissions in a crowded city with high-rise buildings doesn't have the same impact as GHG emissions in the stratosphere. Third, because the cleanup technology differs. Even for the same pollutant, if you think about plastic, cleaning plastic from our oceans, from our rivers, from our streets, from our food chain requires different type of technologies. And therefore, the costs of impact differ across layers, even for the same pollutant. So what does that mean? If we introduce the layers of space and that dimension into finance, then we're going to realize that we have a missing principle too, because risk and time define our relationship with risk and time. So we need a new principle that defines our relationship with space, that establishes our spatial responsibility. And that's where the space value of money principle comes in. And it states that the dollar invested in space must, at the very least, have $1's worth of positive impact on space. Now, the point of this principle is that it acts as the bottom threshold of investment acceptability. It requires that investments have a positive impact, something that our current principles do not, which also explains our current predicament. Now, what does all this do? Well, introducing the dimension, the principle, what it does is basically it transforms formally the stakeholders of our financial models. The mortal risk-averse investor is not the only stakeholder anymore. Planet and humanity are equal stakeholders. This is on the broadest level. Now, the framework itself, I then go on to obviously offer the double timeline through which we can measure the time risk value as well as space value of cash flows. I introduced the concept of net space value of investment. I also, all the elements of net space value, from pollution to biodiversity loss, human capital, etc., etc. And then I introduced multiple impact intensity concepts and equations. Then I introduced the concept of the space growth rate. And then finally, I offer space-adjusted equations for value and return. Now, I cannot go into the equations, obviously, for obvious reasons, but this is the entire the breadth of the framework, and I'm happy to discuss this at another opportunity. Now, but what I do want to do with the remaining time is to discuss the implications of introducing the dimension of space as well as the space value money principle and the ensuing equations on money mechanics, i.e. the process of money creation and monetary policy transmission. Now, let me again take a step back and mention that the sustainable finance field today, all the frameworks and standards and tools, they treat money and its logic as exogenous, as if it's immaterial to the sustainability challenge. And I believe that's a very serious omission. Now, if investors are going to respect the space value of money principle, and they're going to apply the following equations, then so must money creators. And whether they are commercial banks or central banks. Now, if that was to be introduced, then immediately this implies that this will have technical implications on the assets and portfolios that central banks and banks, as commercial banks, can use when they engineer and when they create new deposits and new money. Now, I'm not going to go into the technical discussion, obviously, but I am going to address on a very high level, 3 challenges that this entire framework reveals with our monetary architecture today. Now, our monetary architecture is debt-based, which means that money in all its forms, i.e. currency, bank deposits, as well as central bank reserves, they are all created through debt-based transactions and instruments. And this is very important because when we introduce space and the principle of space value of money, we realize that there are a few systemic challenges here. One I call calendar time. Why calendar time? Well, obviously there are many different types of calendars that we use, but ultimately, the reason you could figure out what time to arrive here and you knew your GPS or your Uber app figured out how to get here is because there is an imaginary line and a point called the prime meridian, which is already factored into your software, obviously, which is also the foundation of all our clocks and our maps, which defines which time zone you are, etc., which actually is the cornerstone of our industrial capacity, to organizing our industrial activities. But when it comes to using calendar as a foundation of money creation, we face a very serious challenge because calendar time has a fixed pace. And when you create money with debt instruments which have calendar time obligations, this entire grid acts like a muzzle because, well, we cannot invest in space timelessly because our entire monetary architecture is built on time-linked, calendar time-linked instruments. The second challenge I call monetary gravity. Now, when we create money via debt instruments, and therefore all debt instruments, all money creating instruments involve a calendar time set of obligations, but they also involve a backward loop to the creator of money. You have to pay back. In other words, this means that when we create money through debt, we actually impose a distance on how far in space any investment or process can go before it has to return to some bank. Even if you're paying electronically, the logic of the instrument imposes that backward loop and therefore that limitation. Last, finally, The final challenge, which basically acts as a leash. And the third one, which I call monetary hunger. Monetary hunger basically is born from the fact that at any point in time, in any debt-based economy, because we create money via debt continuously, at any point in time, you have a segment of society that is chasing cash and deposits to make calendar time-based debt obligations. That's what I call monetary hunger. That hunger is created through the debt-based system. Now, with voluntary emissions frameworks and a legal threat of default, all investors and borrowers and businesses will serve their debts before they serve the environment. And therefore, the debt-based monetary architecture, when it has primacy over our ecosystem, there is no way we can address, especially because this actually also acts as a whip. Last point in terms of the current system, in our monetary system, we have some popular misconception that cryptocurrencies are an alternative to fiat money or debt-based money. Now, let me say that they're not. They're not as sustainable. They may have their uses for different people as assets or other. And they have many issues from carbon footprint to electronic waste footprint and so on and so forth. But the real reason that they're not sustainable alternative is their logic of money creation. If you know anything about Bitcoin mining, you know that money, the process of creation is based on mathematical guesswork. So we're moving from debt to mathematical guesswork. And that's why I argue that they are not an alternative. My final point is that we are in dire need of a money mechanics that actually creates positive space value and allows us to address our many evolutionary challenges. I offer a channel which I call value easing, which echoes quantitative easing and credit easing, which is based on instruments that I propose called public capitalization notes, which address all of the previous challenges mentioned. They allow the money creators to have a positive space impact, and also they can potentially be the blueprint through which we finance the transition, as well as other huge, massive investments we need to do to address the evolutionary challenges we face. Finally, I offer these, the space value money framework, the books, as one possible alternative way through which we can secure not just the sustainability, but also the future expansion of human productivity across time and across space. That brings me to the end. So thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Thank you very much. If you have any questions, just please go ahead. Yes.
Yeah, I'm not sure if you can hear me, but
Yeah, push the button.
it's novel, isn't it? I was looking at the diagram where you have the different layers of space, and I'm not sure if I've got this right, but I think what you're saying is that you're needing to consider another aspect of how polluting assets are impacting those different areas. Is that right?
Yes.
It is. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And as I mentioned, those layers are not, they're conceptual. It's a conceptualization of space as a continuum, as a context of matter that stretches from subatomic space to interstellar space, and they can be defined as, you can add sublayers to them as well. So it's a way to conceptualize the dimension of context. Then at the second stage, then the impact on them, obviously. Yes.
Do you want to give your example of a plane taking off?
the one that really brought it home for me.
Yeah, well, the idea that, I mean, I don't know exactly which, I can't remember exactly if I.
Different layers.
Yes, different layers, yeah. To think about it this way, we're focused on emissions, on climate. Most of the debate and the rhetoric is focused on climate. But in truth, we can have zero emission companies that are literally creating nanotoxins in a world that isn't necessarily within our frameworks at the moment, or the rockets that are spreading debris in lower Earth orbit or in the exosphere. The concept of polluting space, of generating waste in our context of matter requires that treatment, because there's so many contexts of matter that we operate and live in. And so cash flows could be operating in and as well as affecting different layers. And that's the idea. You had a...
Thank you, Armen. So I was really interested in your point that the disclosure frameworks today aren't really designed to incentivize anything more than just disclosing metrics. They're not about kind of incorporated in company strategies. Companies, however, are investing a lot of effort at the moment, whether it's, as you mentioned, all the sort of alphabet soup of TCFD, the one for nature now, and the CSRD. What trick has been missed, do you think, in kind of converting those efforts that are being put into disclosures into something which instead should go closer to the heart of the decisions and the financial flows of money that companies are making off the back of all the effort that they are putting in into creating those new frameworks around disclosures?
Yes, I think that's a very good point. And I'm going to give the example of the standards, which are also inspired by TCFD and the frameworks. If you were to read there's a specific section in the S1 and S2 IFRS standards where it is stated plainly that all these things, all these factors may affect your decision to provide resources to the said entities, and you can use the factors and the variables that you've been using, like riskiness and the same variables of our equations that we've been used, and ESG integration, which uses those frameworks and the same frameworks that you were mentioning. So the application leg, so to speak, from the reporting or all those the frameworks and the standards is that our interpretive framework is in finance, not in the actual reporting of the information. And therefore, to be able to operationalize the reported information, investors have to use them. And it has to plug into the investor's analytical framework. And as of now, I don't think they do. So, thank you. Yes, please.
I feel under pressure now. I just wanted to get your thoughts. Really interesting, and it's fascinating. It is definitely the future. But I wanted to get your thoughts on: do we actually already have some of the right tools? We're just using them in the wrong way. So, for example, if you take something like CAPM as a basic tool within finance, is it just that we're optimizing for the wrong thing? That we're optimizing, as you kind of touched on, in a financial plane, and actually what we should be doing is optimizing over a multi kind of temporal time horizon rather than a single time horizon, and optimizing not just in the financial plane, but at a very simple level with almost budget constraints embedded for the costs to the environment. And leading on from that, I'd like to get your thoughts on how it can be implemented, because my instinct is that the challenge is that for an individual, understanding their financial and other risk tolerances within their lifetime is relatively straightforward. It's still challenging, but relatively straightforward. But to try and get an individual to embed into those optimizations multi-generational costs. That's where I see the real challenge about all this. And I guess it's a societal point fundamentally, but I'd just like to get your thoughts on that.
I think I'm going to respond to the first part, the first bit of your question, I think, regarding whether if there's something missing or were we doing the right thing or not. I actually think there's something missing. I'm biased, so I think we have an entire analytical dimension missing in CAPM. You mentioned the CAPM, the capital asset pricing model. In the CAPM, risk is measured as time-based performance. There's no space-based performance. Beta is a statistical measure that reveals the slope of a regression line between the market return and the individual stock return. There's no planet, no context, no reality, just as much as there isn't any in the other equations. So there is something missing. And then next, as to how do we address them? Well, as I've said, I mean, there is, just because businesses and you and I, or individually, we become more sustainable, or we force all these regulations on companies, we have to look at the monetary architecture as well. I mean, all these corporates, all these households, they operate within a debt-based monetary architecture that creates macro level limitations on the entire planet. So there are many layers to this challenge. And I think omitting the subject of money creation is one of the biggest omissions. So of sustainable finance, not ignoring that. So there's many layers. I know you said many different things, so I'm trying to pick in to respond to a few of them. So, but that would be my response. So there's, on a personal level, interpersonal, the costs to individual sustainability and the challenges of individual sustainability on a business level and individual level. When you have a monetary architecture that works the way it does, I mean, we have to address these issues at much more fundamental level if we are actually going to be able to change course. Thank you.
One last. Actually two, but very quick.
Yes, please, of course.
So the first one is kind of specific, and the second more general, and they're related, no? So the first is the framework aims at in assessing the cost, the impact of any investment on the different layers of space. So is this impact computed as the cost of reverting it? So let's say the cost of polluting a river, is that cost estimated as how much it would cost to return the river to its previous environmental ecological state, or is it differently estimated? And the second question, more general, is what the framework does really is to internalize what economists call externalities. So at the moment, there is a massive free riding. People, let's say any company, just simply, let's say airlines, they don't pay for the damage that CO2 emissions cause, and therefore also those who use airplanes don't pay for that. Nobody pays, and the global system will pay. So clearly, internalizing those costs would cause a major redistribution of wealth, of value, especially for all those legacy assets. You know, all the firms that today are enjoying those negative externalities. So in history, such huge redistribution of wealth did not happen without bloodbaths and revolutions. So is that the way forward?
Definitely not. Definitely not. A good point. A good point. The first one, yes, the framework considers when you address specifically pollution and biodiversity. So I'm going to respond to that because the Space Value Framework considers human capital impact, R&D impact, new asset impact, new money impact. It treats all the many dimensions of impact, planetary, economic, and human. So specifically about the planetary aspect, yes, it considers the cleanup costs and the restoration costs. And that is not because we are condoning the process and suggesting that they clean up. No, the idea is more preemptive, that investments and cash flows must be valued taking into account the costs that it would take to actually clean up the pollution and waste left over. So that's correct. In terms of the second question, yes, it's true. The framework allows the internalization of externalities before they are misnamed as externalities. And because it's before they are misnamed, they actually can play a transformational role. It's not just about absorbing the costs into prices, because that's most of how the debate on externalities works. They focus always whether these prices should reflect these social costs or not, and how, and via taxes, subsidies. So it's not, that's not the right, in my approach, that's not how it is. It's by integrating these costs and by preventing them through the value framework, you can weed out and you can actually implement that transition. So without bloodbath. So, thank you. Good questions. Thank you very much.